This ride has been entertaining people for a century now, as you heard. But that's only part of what makes it special. Over the Jumps is a unique type of carousel. Only a handful were ever made, and this is the last one known in operation anywhere in the world. The best part, though, is that unlike a lot of one-of-a-kind, unique antiques, this is not hidden away in a museum somewhere, off limits to touch. This carousel is working. You can ride it just like it's been doing for 100 years. So you can enjoy it the same way that your grandparents did, or maybe even their grandparents. What are the odds, though? I mean, if you think about it, the vast majority of historic wooden carousels have long since ceased to exist. In the golden age of carousels, from the mid to late 1800s on up through the 1930s, many thousands of hand-carved wooden carousels were produced, maybe 8,000, depending on who's counting. But today, only around 200 remain. Again, maybe fewer, depending on who's counting. Because over such a long period of time, carousels are vulnerable to deterioration, abandonment, and ruin. Upkeep is expensive, and handmade carousel animals are valuable. So carousels that do remain are often broken up and sold piece by piece to collectors. Over the Jumps has faced most of these threats as well throughout its history, but its owners for the first 70 years kept it together, kept it painted, kept it running, and then in the 1990s, just when things were looking really bleak, a remarkable statewide campaign of volunteers and specialists rallied to save this treasure. And this is the story. The Over the Jumps carousel debuted in the summer of 1924 at the Aurora Exposition and Fair in Aurora, Illinois. It was owned by C.A. Wortham's World's Best Shows, a traveling carnival company that toured a circuit of central states. For that reason, the new carousel was a transportable model. It was made to be taken apart, packed into trucks or trains, and then reassembled at the next location. For nearly 20 years, this carousel traveled with the carnival from state to state, delighting riders at fairs, both big and small, including the Arkansas State Fair a few times during the 1920s and 30s when it was held here at Fair Park. And this is still the location where it is today. More on that in a minute. But, you know, over the years, our traveling carousel was treated the way you would have expected. It was used constantly. It was ridden. As paint wore off the horses, they were repainted, often very differently from what they had been previously. Mechanical parts got repaired and replaced as needed. In fact, the track underneath that the platform turns on as it rotates is actually not original. It seems to have come from a different ride called the Caterpillar. The carousel was originally powered by a steam engine, but at some point early on it was converted to electricity. A couple of the horses even ended up getting swapped out. Carousel experts have identified that 38 of the 40 horses were produced by the Spillman Engineering Company, or its predecessor, the Herschell-Spillman Company, in the 1920s. But 2 of the horses are Trojan, or Roman type, with cropped manes. And if you look closely, you can see them. That's the distinctive design of the Allen Herschel Company, a related but competing carousel manufacturer. All of these companies were based in North Tonawanda, New York, and they were the nation's leading manufacturers of transportable country fair-style carousels. But although Allen Herschel, Herschell-Spillman, and Spillman Engineering manufactured thousands of hand-carved wooden carousels like this one not exactly like this one, but they manufactured thousands over the course of the late 1800s to early 1900s, they didn't make many quite like this one, because Over the Jumps is a special model. You'll notice that the floor is not flat. It's wavy. And the horses, they're not attached to poles that go up and down vertically as they go around. They're attached to the flexible wooden platform that rolls along on the undulating track, which causes the horses to pitch back and forth as they go. And it's like they're flying over hills and valleys. It's a much more realistic feeling of going over the jumps. This design was never mass produced or offered in catalogs as a standard production model, because although the new type of motion was very popular with riders, the carousel, it was prone to breaking down, and it spent as much time being repaired as in operation. So as an expensive, high-maintenance ride, it wasn't actually in high demand among the operators. It is believed that the Spillman Engineering Company only produced 10 or so no more than 10 of this type of carousel, and many believe there was actually more like 4 or 5. This is the last known one in existence, let alone in operation. Legend has it that one of the other ones sank during ocean transport, and that 2 of them were lost in fires. That hasn't been verified. I didn't verify it, but that's the story that's been told. Nevertheless, we've been saying that this is the last one for decades, and nobody has come forward to say, no, we know of another one. Over the Jumps really made an impression when it debuted in 1924. In its first few years, newspapers from Dallas to Kalamazoo often named it, along with the Caterpillar, as one of the modern rides being offered at fairs to attract visitors. The newspaper Florida Times-Union of Jacksonville described it for their readers. They wrote, "A wonderful new ride is Over the Jumps. Built by Spillman Engineering Company under patents originated by H.F. Maines, known for his Caterpillar and Over the Falls, 2 of the biggest sensations ever presented in the realms of shows playing under canvas. Over the Jumps is having its premiere in Jacksonville. Brand new, it is the big attraction among the rides. It is an ocean wave arrangement, built close to the ground, however, and when seated, the little horses roll in a gentle grade up and down." Here at Fair Park, back home in Arkansas, a permanent amusement park midway became part of the landscape in 1929, part of a multi-year development plan that included this zoo, a ballpark, golf course, and swimming pool. The midway, I believe, was located just over there where the parking lot is now. And I was not around during those times. I'm new to Arkansas, and so many of y'all would be able to tell me more about that. Now, traveling companies, well, actually, there was a permanent amusement park operator that was working here in the 1920s and 30s, a company named Keenan, Hempel, and McQuilkin of Oklahoma City. They leased that midway for several years in the 1930s. They had some amusements on it, including a miniature train and some kind of carousel. And then also traveling companies would set up temporary carnivals at Fair Park, a notable one being the Goodman Wonder Shows. They traveled the country, but Little Rock was where they wintered. Goodman Wonder Shows seems to have been the owners of this Over the Jumps carousel, at least by the late 1940s. And so it's reasonable to assume that they brought it here, that this carousel was making visits here during that time when they would winter and also set up carnivals here. That Fair Park Midway, though, caught the eye of a traveling carnival owner named Tom Fazell, who had Fazell's United Shows. He was looking to settle down with an amusement park in a permanent location, so he leased the Fair Park Midway from the city in 1942, and he established his fun park here. The previous tenants, Keenan, Hempel, and McQuilkin, had to go, taking their old train ride and carousel with them. The loss of that carousel prompted a small burst of nostalgia. The Arkansas Gazette lamented that Little Rock said goodbye to a Fair Park merry-go-round on which perhaps half the children in the city have ridden during the past 17 years. You all could probably relate to the nostalgia. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of sweat in my eyes and it's burning. You all could probably relate to the nostalgia of losing a carousel. But at the same time, I feel like it sounds kind of ironic now, given the fact that the departure of that carousel was actually going to be the opportunity for the arrival of a legend that has made so many more memories. Because within a few months, in 1943, Fazell bought Over the Jumps from the Goodman Wonder Shows and installed it permanently here in Fair Park. And Arkansas children are still making memories on it over 80 years later. This is an interesting thing. Buying the carousel for Fazell wasn't a stroke of genius. He got lucky. What he really wanted was a rare 19th century Wurlitzer band organ. The Arkansas Democrat interviewed him several years later in 1969 and reported that to get the organ, he had to buy 2 rides along with it. One, the Flying Horses merry-go-round, which he thought would be a bust, but which is still a favorite among the children. The package deal, as he remembers it, cost him around $20,000. That organ rested in a carnival wagon in front of the pavilion and played the tunes as the carousel turned. Years came and went, and new rides and attractions were added. Fair Park was renamed War Memorial Park after the end of World War II. Feazell managed the park for 30 years and turned it over to Doc O'Kelly in 1973. And somewhere along the way, that organ faded into history. But the carousel gained a loyal following. One kid who grew up riding this carousel and loving it was Lloyd Schote, better known as Moki. The Schotes were a traveling carnival family based out of White County. As an adult, Moki Schote toured with his family show for a while, but then in 1982 he bought War Memorial Amusement Park from Doc O'Kelly. Schote explained, "I'd wanted it ever since I was a kid, but I couldn't afford it. The man that owned it kind of made it where I could." The carousel, of course, would be the main attraction. Schote admitted, "That's the reason I really liked the park. I was interested in the old merry-go-round. Adults like me who rode it as kids have kids of their own now." And what he said then is still true today. There's a lot of folks got a lot of memories in this park. But with every passing year, the condition of this carousel and other historic wooden carousels was getting more precarious. In 1983, the year after Schote took over War Memorial Amusement Park, the National Carousel Association sounded the alarm about risks to these carousels. In a letter to preservation officers around the country, they wrote, "As the years pass, we lose a minimum of 10 to 12 carousels a year due to speculators after the wooden animals, as well as to natural causes. Soon there will scarcely be a carved wooden carousel in America unless we all work together." For Arkansas, they called particular attention to over the jumps as an especially noteworthy merry-go-round, which, if destroyed, would, quote, "be a tragic loss to America's heritage." They reiterated the urgency of carousel preservation, saying, "At the rate they are falling, within 10 years, the great American carousel could be only a memory." Of course, this was 40 years ago. Schote knew the treasure that he had. He knew this was the last one of its kind, and that the wooden horses were no longer being made. But those horses had been carrying kids over the jumps for 60 years by that point, and they were showing signs of wear. The paint was old and cracked. Schote knew they needed to be stripped and repainted. He was interested in restoring the carousel, but it would be a tedious and very costly process, which would require grant assistance. A person could only do so much. But what he could do was hold on to it. Schote had a modern carousel that he sold for $125,000. An intact wooden Spillman from the 1920s was priceless. There was a lively collector's market for original hand-carved horses, and even in those days, he knew he could have easily gotten originally gotten 4 figures for those horses. But Schote resolutely refused to consider selling over the jumps. In early 1989, he and Julius Breckling, director of Little Rock Parks and Recreation, approached the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program about getting the carousel listed on the National Register of Historic Places. National Register listing is honorary, and it doesn't directly prevent the destruction of historic properties, but it can unlock a lot of preservation resources, including significant grant funding in some cases. Among city and state officials, there was unanimous support in pursuing this National Register listing. And yes, I believe that childhood nostalgia did play a role in that. In December 1989, the Over the Jumps carousel was officially granted National Register status. But the clock was ticking. The ride was becoming increasingly dilapidated. It, and especially the horses, were in need of repair and restoration. Above all, the pavilion roof that protected the ride desperately needed to be replaced. It got to the point that they had to stop running the ride because the vibrations could collapse the structure. Choate was unsuccessful in lobbying the city of Little Rock to help pay for a new roof. By 1990, the amusement park's heyday was past anyway, and Little Rock was exploring plans to redevelop War Memorial Park and do away with the Midway. A feasibility study suggested that the Carousel could be incorporated into the zoo. So Choate was faced with selling out and shutting down the amusement park. Offers came from buyers in Great Britain, Las Vegas, and Texas to purchase the Carousel. Choate put them off, saying it's not for sale, not just yet, in the hopes that a local buyer could be found to keep it in Arkansas. And here's where the story gets really heartwarming. Because in 1991, citizens from around the entire state began pulling together in a massive, sustained project to save the endangered over-the-jumps carousel. A woman from Stamps heard that the carousel might be sold out of state, so she contacted State Senator Mike Kennard because she knew he liked carousels. Senator Kennard reached out to Governor Bill Clinton's office and was referred to Ken Grunwald at the Department of Arkansas Heritage. Ken and his wife Marlena were already keen on the carousel, especially with the department having recently nominated it to the National Register of Historic Places. So, together with Kennard, they spearheaded the formation of a nonprofit organization called Friends of the Carousel to purchase and restore this piece of history. Volunteers joined an executive board and statewide committee, and led by people like Joan Gould and David Martinus, they organized an ambitious undertaking. Choate would sell over the jumps to the Friends of the Carousel for a reduced price of $250,000. But they would have to put the first $75,000 down within 3 months and pay the balance within 6 months. To raise that kind of funding in such a short time, they blitzed the media, they took out advertising, wrote stories about the carousel and about the project. They launched a large-scale, open-ended fundraising campaign because they knew that it wasn't going to end at $250,000. That's just to get the carousel. Once they had the carousel in hand, it might cost another $1 million to restore it and put it in a permanent location. With the appeal to keep the memories turning, they solicited donations of all amounts and kinds. An individual membership in Friends of the Carousel was priced at $10, with additional levels of prestige attached to higher levels of giving. So for example, for $5,000, you could adopt a horse and become a pony parent. Under each pair of horses here, you're going to see a plaque that has their names. Those are the names given by their pony parents. The Friends of the Carousel didn't make the 6-month fundraising deadline, but Choate gave them an extension. And in 1992, after the Friends of the Carousel purchased over the jumps, they dismantled the ride, put the parts in storage just before the pavilion roof collapsed. Now began the next phase, restoration. Becky Witzel oversaw the process of restoring the horses. After some training and consultation, the committee decided the best approach was going to be the one that's the most difficult. Rather than chemically strip the horses down to the wood and apply fresh paint, they needed to carefully remove the accumulated layers of paint down to the original, to identify what that original paint was so that it could be replicated. Witzel and a team of highly trained paint pickers scalpeled away bygone eras of paint, layer by painstaking layer. They sent samples of the original paint to a laboratory for analysis, and then once it was documented and all the colors, the original paint scheme and decorations were known for each horse, then the original paint layer was fully removed because they had to, because it contained all kinds of toxic ingredients like lead. The horses were then repainted in the original scheme with fresh, non-toxic paint that matched the original look. Horses and chariots during this process were shuttled around between different workers all around the state as each undertook a portion of the project, 1 or maybe 2 horses at a time. The work of repairing broken parts, because some of the horses were broken, that fell to Rick Parker and Bob Pinnock at Parker Restoration in Gentry, as well as paint removal and restoration. Many horses had 30 layers of paint. One even had 43. In other words, over 67 years of that Carousel's career up to that point, from 1924 to 1991, the horses were being repainted every other year or so. The laborious restoration process of the horses and chariots alone ultimately took 14 years. In addition, the mechanical parts had to be reconstructed and a new pavilion had to be built. Restoration work was conducted as the funds were available, so fundraising was a constant process. Now that the carousel was in storage, they couldn't let it become out of sight, out of mind, or the donations would dry up. So Friends of the Carousel held workshops on restoration and conservation each year throughout the state. They loaned out restored horses for exhibits at museums. They made presentations to civic groups. They partnered with schools and helped them integrate aspects of the project into various curricula. And for several years, they maintained an open studio in Little Rock where the public could visit, see the work taking place, and gain an appreciation for the project. None of this was straightforward and simple, though. Conditions kept changing, and they had to remain agile. There was no single storage site large enough for all the carousel pieces, so the parts were cataloged and then housed all across the state, wherever secure space could be found. In 1998, the building that housed the studio was sold, and the Friends of the Carousel had to find a new location for their studio and office purposes. They moved temporarily into the Choctaw Route station. That's that old train depot east of downtown. This was after the Spaghetti Warehouse had closed, but before the Clinton School of Public Service opened up, so it was vacant. They stored parts there, horses, office supplies and records, furniture, but in 2000, burst water pipes and the subsequent collapse of part of the ceiling damaged some of those horses and stands, chariots, wheels, and office materials that were in the room below. Once again, new space had to be found and items had to be relocated. Meanwhile, funding continued to pour in from individual donations, pony adoptions, aluminum can recycling drives, and numerous grant applications. For example, the Department of Arkansas Heritage awarded over $200,000 in grants over several years in the 1990s. But you've got to know that money does not tell the full story. Countless people also made in-kind contributions, whether that was storage space, volunteer labor, free publicity, museum exhibits, transportation, etc., etc. There were many, many heroes in this story. The rescue and restoration of the Over the Jumps Carousel was truly a statewide community effort, thanks to the tenacious commitment of many people over many decades, investing their time, money, labor. This carousel has been preserved for us today. And in 2007, 16 years after the ride closed down, it reopened in its new permanent location right here at the Little Rock Zoo, just a stone's throw from where it had used to stand on the War Memorial Park Midway. So that brings us to today. Since 2007, Over the Jumps has been back in operation. It's 100 years old now, this year, and if it continues to be well cared for, as I know it will continue to make memories for people for generations to come. Its National Register status helps it qualify for historic preservation restoration grants from the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program. So, for example, it's already received another $76,000 from AHPP just since 2010 for additional restoration work necessary to preserve it, especially given the wear and tear of daily use. In fact, at any given time, you may see a couple horses missing as they're rotated out to the shop for repainting and refurbishing. This carousel requires a lot of ongoing care and investment, but it's a small price to pay for preserving this national treasure here in Arkansas and keeping it running for public enjoyment.